Hey everyone, welcome to this High Yield Explainer. I'm your tutor today and we're tackling a massive topic, behavior assessment. Whether you're gearing up for a big behavior analysis exam or you're just ready to stop guessing and start truly understanding why behaviors happen, you are in the exact right place. We've distilled everything down into a tight, highly visual study guide. So let's just jump right in, shall we?
Here's our syllabus for today's crash course. First up, defining target behavior. Then we'll break down the ABCs and finding the function. Clarify preference versus reinforcement, and we're going to finish strong with a practice test masterclass.
All right, part 1, defining target behavior. Now, before we can even think about assessing or intervening on a behavior, we've got to put on our detective hats. We absolutely must define exactly what we're looking at. No guessing allowed. And hey, no opinions either. Saying something like the client is aggressive is a really bad definition. Like, what does that actually look like? Instead, we need crystal clear operational definitions. So aggression becomes hitting with a closed fist. Elopement is stepping more than 3 feet away without permission. Tantruming? Crying with tears for more than 30 seconds. So here is a huge exam rule for you. Always pick the definition that is clear, observable, and measurable. Basically, any two people should be able to watch and completely agree on whether the behavior happened or not.
Okay, so how does this fit into our overall strategy? Think of this as your ultimate assessment cheat sheet. Notice the vital differences here. Indirect assessment, that means you're just asking others, like doing a parent interview, but you are not actually watching the behavior yourself. Direct assessment, on the other hand, means you are observing the behavior with your very own eyes. Now within that, descriptive is observing it naturally without changing a single thing, whereas a functional analysis, or FA, means you are actively manipulating the environment. You've got to keep these distinct categories locked in your mind.
Moving on to Section 2, ABCs and finding the function.
Let's talk about tracking natural events out in the real world to figure out the elusive why behind a behavior. ABC. It stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Take a student named Leo, for example. The antecedent is homework is presented, the behavior is Leo cries, and the consequence is the homework is removed. Or, let's say, the iPad is removed, Leo hits, and the consequence is the iPad is returned. By tracking these naturally occurring events, we can start to see some real patterns. But wait, here is a massive exam rule. Descriptive assessments, like ABC data, can only suggest a possible function. They literally never prove it. Why? Because you aren't manipulating anything.
So if you want to actually prove the function of a behavior, you need a functional analysis, or FA. In an FA, we're actively arranging conditions to test for the 4 main functions: attention, escape, tangible, or automatic. Let's look at this specific example where we're testing for an attention function. Step 1, you withhold attention. Step 2, you wait for the target behavior to happen, like screaming, for instance. Step 3, if the screaming happens, you immediately deliver attention. If the screaming happens a whole lot during this specific condition, boom, you've successfully demonstrated that the behavior is maintained by attention. It's a highly controlled test.
All right, Section 3, preference versus reinforcement.
You know, this is absolutely one of the most frequently confused concepts on any behavior exam. A preference assessment simply asks, what does the learner like? What might they prefer? That's it. But a reinforcer assessment goes further and asks, does this item actually increase behavior when it's delivered after a response? Listen, just because a child chooses an iPad during a preference assessment doesn't automatically mean it's a guaranteed reinforcer. A reinforcer, by its very definition, must increase the behavior it follows. So don't ever confuse a possibly preferred item with a tested, proven reinforcer.
And now we've arrived at Section 4, the Practice Test Masterclass.
It is time for some active recall. But hey, before we jump into the very first question, I really want to spotlight this golden rule right here. Behavior analysts do not diagnose medical conditions, period. If a behavior suddenly changes, is incredibly severe, or looks like it might involve pain or illness, like a toothache or an ear infection, your absolute first step is to recommend a medical referral. Keep that rule out front and center at all times. All right, let's get into it. Question 1. A parent, let's call him David, completes a questionnaire about when his child's tantrums usually occur. What type of assessment is this? Think back to our cheat sheet for a second. You are relying on a parent's report here, not your own eyes. The answer is B, indirect assessment. Because the analyst is asking someone else for information through a questionnaire and not directly observing the tantrum themselves, this falls firmly into the indirect category.
Let's keep this momentum going. Question 2. A behavior analyst observes little Sam and records what happens right before and right after his aggression. What is this specific direct assessment called? Answer A. ABC data. You're directly recording the antecedent, what happens before, the behavior, and the consequence, what happens right after. Great job if you recognize that foundational pattern.
Moving on to question 3. A behavior analyst arranges attention, escape, tangible, and control conditions to test exactly why a behavior occurs. What is this? Now pay very close attention to the words arranges and tests in this scenario.
Answer B. Functional analysis. Because you are actively manipulating those conditions to actually test the function. Rather than just passively observing naturally occurring events, this is an FA. Remember, this is the only way to truly demonstrate functional relations. All right, question 4. A teacher reports that 10-year-old Chloe hits when math work is presented, and the work is usually removed afterward. What is the possible function here? Remember the exam rule I gave you earlier. Look directly at the consequence for your biggest clue. What happens right after the hitting?
Answer A. Escape. The aversive demand, in this case that pesky math work, was removed immediately following the behavior. Therefore, the data strongly suggests an escape function.
Here we go. Question 5. 7-year-old Maya chooses the iPad first during a multiple stimulus preference assessment, also known as an MSWO. What exactly does this mean? Think back to that crucial distinction we made between liking something and actually changing behavior.
Answer B. The iPad may be preferred. A preference assessment only identifies possible reinforcers. It definitely does not guarantee that the iPad will actually function as a reinforcer until we test it by seeing if it increases a specific behavior over time. Don't fall for the trap of assuming it's a confirmed reinforcer right off the bat. Okay, final question. Question 6. A client, let's say a teenager named James, suddenly begins head-hitting and crying during meals. What should the behavior analyst consider? Look super closely at the phrase suddenly begins during a routine activity. Answer B. Recommend medical consultation or rule out. This totally pays off that golden rule we highlighted earlier. Sudden severe onset behavior changes, especially during something routine like eating, might be related to physical pain, like maybe a terrible toothache. You always rule out medical issues first.
Wow, you made it through the masterclass. Remember the absolute core takeaway from all of this explainer material? Assessment always comes before intervention. We define it clearly, we track the ABCs, we manipulate conditions if we really need to prove a function, and we rigorously test our reinforcers. So the question is, are you ready to finally stop guessing and start assessing? Take this structured, data-driven mindset with you into your exam and out into your real-world practice. Thanks so much for learning with me today. Keep up the fantastic work.